This webinar is going to be about how you tackle loneliness in society, especially with the elderly. And the reason we're doing it is because we've done several events around loneliness. We did a webinar a few months ago on loneliness, which was a very successful one. When we come to Sean, as we are very soon now, you'll find that he works for an organisation called Nurture Development. And again, if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a link to Nurture Development. We've done webinars in the past with Cormac Russell, who founded Nurture Development, and who is a well-known authority on asset-based community development. And if you want to know about that, again, go to that site and you can find out more there. By the way, you probably won't do it while the webinar is recording, but this webinar, when it's finished, will be sent to you as a recording, and you can go on it and you'll get the links again, and you can check up on all those sites later on. Anyhow, we talked about asset-based community development, which is building from the bottom up. And in terms of tackling loneliness, it involves the community. It's a pretty important thing. And this is where I'm going to hand over to Sean, because Sean comes from Nurture Development. That's his area of specialism. And he's going to take us through that now and tell us about it. So Sean, thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks very much for having me today, Francis, and welcome to everyone. So I kind of wanted to start today with posing the question, how do you tackle loneliness? And the answer to me is to build community. Today's presentation is going to offer a view on loneliness from the perspective of asset-based community development, but throughout the presentation, I'll probably shorten to ABCD. And I wanted to start by sharing a quote by John McKnight and Peter Block from a book called The Abundant Community. This is by way of shaping the presentation, but also hope it'll shape the conversation after. And I'm just going to read it as a direct quote. All these people have gifts we need for a really strong community, and many of them desperately need to be asked to join and contribute. Their only real deficiency is their lack of connection to the rest of us. And our greatest community weakness is the fact we haven't seen them and felt their loneliness. We have often ignored or feared them, and yet their gifts are our greatest undiscovered treasure. And for me, when we think about loneliness, and when I was asked to talk about loneliness in elderly people, there's two immediate thoughts that come into my head. The first one is, in the UK context in particular, it feels elderly is often used as a diagnosis of a condition rather than the description of a period in someone's life course. It strikes me that diagnosis, it can really strip senior citizens of their own agency, clearing space for programmes and services to fill that, treating elderly people as old or vulnerable, in fact, not as the wise, gifted, resource-rich citizens who have the most free time to share their gift with others. The second thought is on loneliness. For me, it's often described as an ailment or a condition that we can treat, where we focus on curing the person. We treat it like a pathological condition rather than a neighbourhood challenge, a challenge of disconnection. I'd really suggest that disconnection amongst many groups disabled in our neighbourhoods. This includes senior citizens, but I would go as far as to say anyone that's given a label, such as and has been pushed to the edge of their community. Could be those with physical or intellectual disability, to the single mother providing for her family, or those affected by drug and alcohol misuse. And I genuinely believe that loneliness is caused by the label. So Elad Mansky talks about factors of creating a good life for someone. He talks about these 5 factors, the first one being a caring and loving relationship. The second, place of one's own. The third, making a contribution. The fourth, directing your own life. And the fifth, basic financial security. So what if we see loneliness as actually a disconnection from a good life, a disconnection from one or more of these 5 attributes? How many elderly people do you think have been pushed to the margins of their community having their gifts and their ability to contribute masked by their label of being elderly and vulnerable. All these attributes are affected by the ecosystem, the place where people live, and our own neighbourhoods. I'd argue in particular the neighbourhood is a blank canvas for making a contribution and finding our sense of purpose, in which a befriending service simply cannot scratch. And what I mean by that is, you know, I think about the way we end loneliness, the way we would think about finding love. You know, if we're trying too hard, we're probably not going to find it. And, you know, when I think about helpers in the field of loneliness, I think about it as a model of fixing a problem, rather than offering advice the way a friend or family member might give you. I don't know if this will resonate, but you find love when you're not looking for it. And I think it's something about that indirect building of community that will help fix and end loneliness. An example I want to give, just a really quick example, is when I first started working as a community builder in a neighbourhood, I bumped into a man in the street, and he lived in a terrace row, and all the fences in the street were painted, were unpainted, and they were stainless steel. And he was outside painting his fence jet black, and just his portion of fence was jet black, and everyone else's was stainless steel. So I went up and I had a conversation with him, and he said, you know, it's about time we got these fences painted. I spoke to the housing authority, and they told me that I should just get on with it myself. So the question was, well, don't the rest of the block want to paint their fence? And interestingly, the question really resonated with him, and he said, well, if we had the paint, this is something that we could do. So as a community builder, thinking about how we get people to share their gift with other people and to find people that are missing from the conversation, we set a condition was, if you can get all your neighbours together to paint your fences, then we'll buy the paint. But we'll take that one stage further and say, if there's anyone in the street that can't paint their fence themselves, then neighbours will come together and they will help that other neighbour to paint their fence. And interestingly, what happened from there was, as the neighbours went round, chat door to door, they actually found and connected with people that were isolated in their street, people that they'd never had an opportunity to meet and maybe brushed shoulders with in the street. They now knew their name and they knew about them. And what actually happened was people in the street started to work together to create a nicer looking neighbourhood. And for me, it's the idea that actually when we go indirect, when we look at a fence, we will find the isolated people in our neighbourhood. If we could just go on to the next slide. When we focus on loneliness as a neighbourhood challenge, this brings us to the idea of asset-based community development. As my colleague Cormac would say, rather than ask what community is to you, ask where community is. We believe in the power of the local and the power of local neighbourhoods to define and create solutions to their own problems. ABCD starts with the premise that strong neighbourhoods are healthier, safer, prosperous and more inclusive places to live. As a start point, we must understand and in turn mobilise the local assets of a neighbourhood before we can truly understand what we need from the outside. There are 6 building blocks that make up a neighbourhood anatomy. The gifts of the local individual, the associations, the big, the small, the formal, the informal, but an opportunity for people to come together and amplify their single gift in a group. The institutions that promote citizenship through leading by stepping back. Local exchange, including local business, informal business, and exchange of time and gifts, such as time banking, physical assets, such as the community facilities that we have, parks and outdoor space. And finally, stories, culture and heritage, paying attention to what has happened in the past, but building for a better future. And throughout the rest of the presentation, I'm going to offer some stories that are going to lean into those building blocks. For me, it's the connection and interdependence of these blocks in which we build community. A strong premise of ABCD is that each and every individual has a gift to share without any exception. The challenge is how we make these gifts visible. And when we talk about loneliness, we are talking about the disconnection of local neighbourhood to these gifts. An ABCD practitioner works alongside residents to uncover these gifts and put them into action with one another. An important question a practitioner will always ask is, who's missing from the table? Who's been pushed to the margins of their neighbourhood, and how do we get them involved in community life? This, in my mind, is how we address loneliness, and by building hospitable, welcoming communities for the stranger on the edge. We could just jump to the next slide, please. I often hear people challenge me and say, you know, it's not easy, communities are chaotic and messy places. And I think they're right. It's not easy and it is chaotic, and I certainly don't contest that. What I do think is that community is worth investing in. It is worth investing the time, energy and resources in building a welcoming community for all. You know, so there's this kind of, I think the last slide jumped over and it was a big naughty mess of wool. And this slide here shows, you know, actually the way we often treat neighbourhoods. You know, we treat people in silos. You know, for example, why do our wise senior citizens get siloed out of relationship with young people, unless under the strict supervision of paid professionals and labelled with being intergenerational? You know, why do we work tirelessly to keep people apart in neat little bundles, such as separating young people out of work from their local economy? The segregation of community is what suits the big systems such as the local government, rather than the way local people live their lives. I'm just going to offer you two stories of examples of how people have reconnected purpose and gifts of those on the edge back into the centre of their community. If we could just jump to the next slide. First story I want to offer is a really, really simple one. As a community builder based out at neighbourhood level, I have the fortune of spending most of my time outside on the street. And this particular story is about a guy called Bill. Bill has an intellectual disability. He lives at home. He's non-verbal and he's cared for by a carer. When I met Bill and his carer walking down the street, we stopped for a chat. His carer tells me that every morning Bill shoots down to the local newsagent and grabs himself a paper. On his way down, he likes to shut the gates of every house on the households on the way down to the newsagents. And actually, that one day the neighbourhood and this street in particular had noticed that Bill's love of shutting these gates and this purpose that it created, and actually organised themselves to leave their gates open for Bill. So each morning Bill shares his gift with the neighbourhood, and conversely the neighbourhood shares a gift that they have in their control, which is the ability to leave their gates open at night. And it just kind of strikes me the idea that you can't actually replicate that in a service. This is something that's neighbourhood based. This is something that a neighbourhood of that's context specific. Could you imagine a world of us just all leaving our gates open and hoping people found purpose in their lives? It just wouldn't happen. The second story I want to share is just, it's a story of a care home in a neighbourhood. It's an 8-person residential care home for people with mental health conditions. I met the care home manager one day, and we sat down over a series of coffees and started to talk about what it was that he cared about as an institution, what it was that he thought that he could contribute. And we got down to one question. You got yourself a Waitrose cup. And the question that we asked was, what have you got so much of in this care home that you could give away? And as with all care homes, they certainly have one thing in common: big, ugly magnolia walls. Big giant ones. So we made an agreement that if we could find local artists in the neighbourhood that would do something with these walls, would the care home manager knock down the doors of his own institution and create a blank canvas for local people to share their gifts? And he agreed. So we put a message on Facebook: 4.5 metre canvas by 2.3 metre canvas seeks the hand of an artist. And over the course of a couple of weeks and months, we were inundated with people wanting to share their gift, from people round the corner from the care home all the way out to graduates from Dundee University. And we accepted the gift, and the care home accepted the gift, but on the condition that we found a space for residents to be involved and to really be part of the journey. And actually, two things really, really stuck out to me. One was, there was a few residents that I bumped into time and time again in the care home that had never had a conversation with me or with anyone that I'd been with. And on that day, those residents in particular created a welcome for people that they'd never met. One went up to their room and brought down a box of chocolates and shared a chocolate with every resident, or every person who came in to share a gift. The other ripped pages out of an old Burns book that basically each person that came in was given a gift. And what happened was, actually it was an equal and fair space for people to share a gift, rather than a charity or giving to another or concentrating on loneliness. What we did was find a blank canvas for people to share together. So in summary, when we build strong and hospitable communities with a welcome for the stranger on the edge, we can find an end to loneliness. But we must look beyond the individual and beyond the loneliness as a diagnosis, and see the gifts and contribution of each and every resident. For me, ABCD offers a way to uncover the assets of a neighbourhood, where the associations, institutions, local exchange, physical assets, culture and heritage all have ways for people to share their gifts, talents and passions with others where they live. So like the video, if we see the neighbourhood as a blank canvas, we find room for everyone to share their worth.
Okay, Sean, let's go back to basics. You've got a lot of, you live in an area, there are a lot of lonely people, and you know there are a lot of lonely people and you don't know how to find them. What does ABCD, asset-based community development, say about how you find those people in the area? What does asset-based community development say about how you map an area, how you socially map an area to identify target problem areas?
Okay, so I'll take the first half of the question. So how do you find people that are isolated? Within asset-based community development, there's a particular description of a type of person in a resident called a community connector. And sometimes it's not helpful to actually share that as a term or a role, but it's more of a function that local people play. So a community connector is a type of person who knows 90 to 100 people in their neighbourhood, who has a passion for connecting. And just to be clear, the difference between connecting and networking. So a connector is someone who connects for the love of connecting with other people, and a networker is someone who, you know, will get something in exchange for making that connection. And for us, connectors are the people that find and know of the isolated people in a neighbourhood. So actually, it's about, in the beginnings of it being in a neighbourhood, it's about finding those people who naturally connect. And inside their DNA, inside all of their knowledge, inside all of these neighbourhood connectors and the rest of the neighbourhood's knowledge is a map of the neighbourhood. And actually it's about eliciting this knowledge in a way that people can share it and use it. That's important. So a physical map isn't as important as being able to share that knowledge together. So examples have been people who start connector tables, where connectors come together and share knowledge and share ideas and share connections. And when the question comes up, who's missing from this conversation, these people know who they are.
But the argument is that in any community, there are lots of assets, there are lots of skills, there's lots of knowledge, there's lots of resources there that are often hidden, that are often untapped. And if you can identify what those are and get people to share them, exchange and engage with them, you can build up what is called social capital. That's capital within a community that people have themselves, and they can then do lots of things provide lots of knowledge, lots of information, lots of services, lots of skills they can exchange that they never realized they had. Now, how you do that and how you build that up is what Korvac's expertise is about. And he has worked with quite a few local authorities, like Croydon, for example, in helping them to develop pilot schemes on finding the hidden strengths and assets of any community. And he has worked with universities as well. There's a university, I think, in Northeast New York, or Northeast America anyhow, which has a whole department on asset-based development. So it is quite a big movement, and it's a way of empowering communities.
What I wanted to speak about for the next 20 minutes or so is what it really means to create community. And I often hear people ask me a question about 10, 20 minutes into a conversation about community, along the lines of, what do you mean by community? Define community. And my answer is to say that community means whatever you say it means. It's one of those words that can mean pretty much anything. A better question, I think, to ask is, where is community? And particularly, where are you local? And that answer, again, is different for different people. But one of the things that I've begun to observe and notice quite a lot is that typically where people are local, where they're in community, a number of things happen. The first thing that happens is that people tend to do three things that I always notice citizens do. The first thing is that they define their own problems. The second is that they define their own solutions to those problems. And the third thing is that they take action together on those solutions. And this is really interesting because in many respects, when we talk about community at that level, the level of citizenship, it's something that happens outside of contract. It's something that happens more in the space of conviviality, of mutuality, of friendship, what some people refer to as the commons. It's really interesting thinking about tonight's sharing, for want of a better way of describing what we're doing together, as being about being in conversation with each other through the commons in a modern kind of sense. And thinking about, you know, several hundred years ago when the American Constitution was written. And recently they've been doing some ethnographic studies on the text of the American Constitution. And they found one of the words that standardly was scrubbed out was the word subject. And in its place was written the word citizen. A really powerful substitution. Because of course, subject means to be, to have an allegiance to a distant king. And citizen means to have allegiance to each other. So I want to talk about that idea of community being a place where we're in the commons as citizens with allegiance to each other, and what we can do in that space to make the world a better place, make our lives better. I'm going to do that through very quick storytelling. The first story I want to share with you is a story about Robin, who lives in Leeds. And when I first met Robin was a gentleman who was attending a service. His wife had passed away, and he was in, I suppose, if you wanted to be technical, he was in the latter stages of grief and quite isolated, and had started to come to a local neighborhood network and trying to rebuild his life. One of the things that became really clear was that Robin was being related to by people very much on the basis of his problems, of what he had lost, of who he had lost, and not on the basis of what he could do to make a difference to his community. Powerfully, when people started asking a different set of questions, instead of asking Robin what was the matter with him, they started asking what mattered to him. They discovered that Robin's passion was around whittering. And whittering, for those of a non-UK background, is something you do with wood and a penknife. And Robin's passion was making walking sticks out of fallen branches in the local park. It was a talent, a passion that he had that nobody had actually known about until they asked him what mattered to him. When he was asked what mattered to him, obviously the next question became, do you want to do something about that? And Robin said yes. And from there has come a wonderful group that Robin leads himself, where he trains not alone people of his age, but also younger people in the local neighborhood how to make walking sticks, not just for older people, but with older people. I tell that story because it's such a common story that I encounter. The details are a little bit different from one story to the next, but the theme is always the same, where when we ask people about their passions and what they care about enough to contribute to their community, we start discovering all kinds of things that lay hidden when all we do is engage with them on the basis of their problems. So I think one of the things that we can do to make a difference in our community, which is the theme of the evening, is ask different questions. Ask people what matters to them instead of what's the matter with them. Ask people where they're strong instead of what's wrong. Ask people where they're feeling connected or where they feel useful rather than where they feel isolated, lonely, and disconnected and useless. So shifting the question is a really powerful way that we can make a difference in our community. Start talking to our neighbors as if they're citizens and not just strangers. I often think that communities are more likely to have individuals in them in the modern age where they're watching an episode of Neighbours or Friends than they are to be making friends with their neighbors. But if we actually started asking each other, what would we love to do with the help of 3 or 4 of our neighbors, we might actually find there's a huge reservoir of potential just lying fallow, waiting to be tapped into. I think the second thing we can do, again, picking up on this theme of what can we do to build powerful communities, is really start believing in the local. I think we've lost faith in community. I honestly think we've started to believe the only way we can build power is through institutions. And actually, we've got a map of society that says there's only 2 dimensions. One is the institutional world and the other is individuals. And we've lost sight of the commons, not all of us, but many of us. And the commons, as I said earlier on, is a place that exists outside of contract. It's a place that's covenantal. It's a place of mutuality. In the commons, I think there's a huge amount of abundance just waiting to be tapped into. But if we don't see it, we won't tap into it. So one of the second things that I'd like to suggest is between the dimensions of the individual and institution is the commons itself. And the commons is made up by associations. The collective word for citizen is association, in the same way that the collective word for bird is flock. So when we talk about building civic power, when we talk about building social movements, we're not just talking about building individuals, and we're not just talking about getting institutions to provide better services. What we're actually talking about is building powerful associations. An association is where people take their individual citizen gifts and they amplify and multiply them by joining them together with their neighbors. And I think a really powerful second thing we can do is to start to build up our associational life by finding out what people care about, but then joining it together with other people at local level. I think this is particularly important for people who are isolated and maybe don't have the mobility to flee from their local neighborhoods to other neighborhoods or indeed to work. So one of the things that I was really struck by last week was I was watching, I'm an avid TED fan, as I'm sure many of you are, so I watch many of the weekly releases, and there's a wonderful presentation about happiness and the 75-year study that's done in the States around happiness. And one of the things that definitively they conclude is what makes us happy is when we lean into relationships, not just with family and not just with friends, but also with neighbors. So I think the second thing we can do is build associational life at street level and start figuring out how we can build those kinds of practical things that matter to us where we live and close to our own doorstep. I often think that initially, while there's a lot of people who are big into campaigning and big into political issues, I think most people, when they're asked what do they care about beyond their friendship and their family, will talk about things that are close to their own doorstep. It's really striking how few of our children are actually allowed to play in our streets anymore. I think that's something that many people care about enough to act upon, maybe in opposing directions. Some want to stop it, others want to enable it. But looking at what has happened, for example, around the play movements in Bristol, I mean, that's very clearly an example of what I'm talking about, where we flip a problem on its head and we see it as an opportunity, and we enable our children to be citizens again, sharing their gifts on the street, respectfully of other people, but learning how to occupy the commons and connect with each other. I think one of the other things that strikes me, and again, it's another story. Recently, I was in the Netherlands and I spent a little time in Amsterdam, and I came across a little coffee shop on a street called Javastraat. And on Javastraat, there was a woman running a little video shop, essentially, although video shops are nearly obsolete now. But as well as being a local businesswoman, she was also linking in with local women and supporting local women to enable them to actually create saving schemes. Many of the local women were in pretty complex relationships where being able to stash a certain amount of money away really mattered. She enabled them to save their money and supported them in a very practical way. She had no background or expertise in money advice or budgeting. She didn't ask for permission to do this. She had no qualification whatsoever. What she was doing was being a good neighbor. And in so many practical ways, I see people at local level enabling each other to just take responsibility and act in all kinds of ways that I think perhaps in the modern age, we have begun to assume that only professionals are qualified to act in. So somehow this lady didn't get the memo that she needed to be qualified or she needed to be a third sector professional to help her neighbors to save in a safe way and in a gender respectful way. The last story I want to share, and then I'll just finish with a couple of concluding thoughts, is a story from the Rift Valley in Kenya. And I spent quite a lot of my time over the years in East Africa generally, and an extended period of time in Kenya. And there are many things that are happening in the Rift Valley over the years, but one of the perhaps most recurrent challenges is the conflict between Pokot and Turkana tribes. And I think when I first arrived there, there was a very strong assumption that the only way that peace could be reintroduced to that region was through outside intervention of aid agencies and governmental oversight. What actually happened, though, was something very different. What created peace in that region didn't come from outside in. It came from the grassroots up. It came from the very people who were living through the problem, some as young as 7 years of age who were walking around the fields at night with decommissioned Russian Kalashnikovs, rustling cattle. And when these local people, either side of the fault line, began to actually recognize that among many other things, that their best land had become a no-go zone, they began to mobilize and they wanted to do something about the conflict. The solution that they came up with was not a solution that I believe any outside agency could have come up with. The solution they came up with was to start actually healing the rift village by village by setting up pastoral field schools, which at local level simply means where if you know something about growing produce or cultivating your land in a region like that, you would share it with your neighbor under a tree and pass that on from one village to the next until you grow a sufficient amount of knowledge that enables the region to be sustainable. That was the basis out of which peace discussions actually emerged. Very few outside individuals could draw a line between a pastoral field school that talks about growing sustainable produce and the negotiation of a peace agreement. But that's precisely how peace between the Pokot and Turkana tribes emerged. I see this over and over again, that top-down doesn't work, that bottom-up and from the sidelines in is what works. But the other thing that I see time and time again is that starting conversations with people on the basis of focusing on what's wrong instead of what's strong doesn't work either. We need to shift the conversation away from what's wrong to a conversation that starts by focusing on what people have that's strong within them that they can use to address what's wrong and make what's strong stronger. So I think in terms of making our communities more effective, more vibrant, and making a difference, the first thing is to start seeing each other as neighbors, not as strangers. The second is to start seeing each other as having gifts and strengths to offer rather than as having problems or as having some intent to take something from us. And I think the final thing is to generally start seeing our communities as the places of great invention. Perhaps in the final analysis, instead of occupying Wall Street, we should start to occupy our street. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Cormac. And you've just proven that sometimes not having PowerPoint slides is very good, because that was incredibly succinct and to the point, and a great story. We've got some questions. What I'm going to do is ask you one of the questions that are coming up. By the way, before I do that, one of the nice things about this webinar jam system is it gives you nice little bits of information. For example, 71% of all those who registered for this webinar have turned up. That is very high. Usually globally it's about 25%, so thank you all for coming. It's been really good that you have turned up. We've had one person who's requested to come on video, and because we've got time, I'm going to accept that request. And if anybody else wants to come on video, please put your hand up to do that. Because this is new to me, I'm not sure how you do that. Colette has done it, and maybe you can tell everyone. But while I get Colette on, maybe I can ask you the question that Bokio asked, and he said, what is the remit, Cormac, of the expert reference group on community organising and Communities First in the UK, and what have you achieved?
Well, it's no longer in existence, I suppose, the first thing to say, as best as I know. So when I was with them about 4 years ago or so, certainly my contribution, which was very modest, was simply to try to remind the government that you can't build community from the government down, and to pay attention to what was already there. But the practical remit was to support the development of community organising in the UK. And what has been achieved? Well, I suppose, as best as I understand it, I was actually speaking to Nick Gardam, who's the CEO of community organising in the UK, that came out of that. There's about 250 community organisers who are working at neighbourhood level, supporting local people to connect and to mobilise around what they care about.
Okay, just to say, Colette, I had invited you on as speaker, so if you want to come on, please do. Simon says, what's your latest thoughts on banking, Cormac? I mean, it's quite a good, interesting question in terms of asset building and learning exchanges, often developing their own currencies.
On time banking, yeah, and alternative currencies. I think it's great. And I think that one of the things that seems really important, particularly, as you say, Francis, in the current climate, is that people take the power to find their own ways of being in relationship with each other and managing local currency, managing the exchange of time, gifts. So time banking is a wonderful way of doing that, and of also creating an equity, so every hour of time, regardless of whether I'm a judge or I'm simply doing something on a voluntary basis in my local community, whatever the contribution is, an hour equals an hour. And I love that equity because, so many of us believe in that ethic when it comes to community. So it's a very powerful tool, I think, for enabling people to have equitable relationships and to rekindle the commons.
Do you know the experiment that's been going on in Canada, Cormac, where they have developed what's called the $half? They actually take a $10 bill, a $5 bill, tear it in half and spend it locally. They can't spend it outside because they've torn it in half, so they can only spend it locally. And if they get enough people to accept it, it increases the social capital of the local community. It develops the community.
I've heard about that, and I think it's a great idea. In the US that you could be arrested for doing that.
I think you probably could.
Probably in Canada as well, but I think our professionals are probably wise enough to be tolerant of those things. It's fantastic. Anything. I mean, it's the whole principle of plugging up the leaky bucket. So much of our local currency, even in so-called low-income communities, flows out to faceless multinationals. So anything that creates an intentionality around keeping that money within the local economy, and more importantly, keeping it cycling. It's the movement that's the most important thing. So that's what's clever about the $half. It keeps the movement and it keeps it local. So it can only be a good thing.
Annette has asked a question both on the chat and on the question and answer, so she must be keen to ask it. She says, how do you deal with local government trying to work against the growth of civic network? Anne just says, well, ignore them and work around them. How do you respond to that, Cormac?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's really struck me over the last 20 years or more is that labels, regardless of how we use them, tend to be a big problem. So I think labeling individuals, whether we label them as bureaucrats or we label them as people with mental health issues, immediately creates a them and us. Now, don't get me wrong. I know that there are power dynamics that exist between institutions and communities. And when you have funding and when you have all kinds of other power, it can be abused as well as wisely used. But I found, to be honest, that when people locally talk about agencies or, institutions that have been helpful, typically they're talking about a person or people. So this idea of local government, it's not a person. And I think the communities that are really finding that they're getting somewhere are often supported by agencies that have figured out how to organize their resources the way the community is organized. And in my experience, that's come about because an individual in the organization has figured out their job is to be of service to the community rather than to be imperial towards the community. So I'm thinking about the likes of Jim Deers in Seattle, who started the Department of Neighborhoods there. And I think it's a fantastic example of a local authority that's learning how to humble itself and remember that its job is not to be the inventor of democracy, but to support local citizens to be the primary inventors of democracy. When it goes wrong, and when local governments start becoming imperial or stifling, typically what you find is the local government has lost its way. It starts thinking about itself as being the inventor or the prime problem solver. And actually, in a lot of ways, communities hand that power over by not reminding local government who is at the center of democracy, which is us as citizens. So one of the big problems, I think, is that the relationship between local government and citizens has gone out askew. And I think most local governments are not relating to citizens, they're relating to clients, and they're basically recruiting clients for their programs. So the best local governments are the ones who recognize their job isn't just to provide services to clients, but to actually be of service to citizens in a democracy. Thankfully, there are some good local governments still left who understand that, and some good disruptive organizing, professionals who understand their job.
Jenny asks, how do you get to UK in this case? So we've got people here from America and New Zealand, and they may have their own experience. Oh, by the way, Danielle said she's just taken part in her first time bank transaction today. Someone cut her hair. You can let us know how she did it, Danielle. That would be quite interesting. But Jenny says, how do you get UK local authorities to understand and engage with local communities, make connections instead of consulting? Amanda partly answers that by saying there is in local government always a champion there, someone that you can go to who's very keen, and you work with them. Would that be your advice, or what would you do, Cormac?
Yeah, but the first thing I do is make sure that the community is actually clear about what it wants to do. You see, my own view is that part of the difficulty is we're leaving the barn gate open on this one. If in local community we could actually get more organized and be clearer at neighborhood level around what we want, as opposed to waiting for outside agencies to come in and consult, which feels to me a very, very different conversation. I think, a lot of what I was talking about during the short presentation I gave was very much based on learning, not just in the UK, but in Australia and in the US and Africa as well. And ultimately, the most powerful communities and the communities with the best relationships with local government in the UK and around the world are the ones that take the initiative to answer three questions. The first question, assuming in the first instance we have a vision for the future, a shared vision for the future. But the first question is, what can we do using the power of local citizens? The second question is, what help do we need from outside? And the third question is, what do we need local government to do for us? Now, my argument is that we've got those three questions back to front, and we're expecting local government to come in and basically answer the third question first, which is what can they do for us? So I think there's something about reclaiming our power as citizens and not being so passive, because in our passivity, we're actually, in a way, teaching public servants to take power that's not theirs in the first place.
Janice has asked a couple of questions, or made one point and asked a question. I mean, the first one's quite interesting because she said that lots of people need to see something tangible before they get involved. And the trouble is that when you start building assets and identifying them in the first instance, you're not always dealing with tangible things. You're dealing with needs. You're dealing with what is possible rather than what is happening. How do you get over that period of, you know, building a network when nothing is happening but hope, and making them realize that it will become tangible in the end?
Yeah, well, I think one of the ways of doing it is by starting to realize that there's kind of an active revelation that's required at the beginning, where we have to make the invisible visible. Because it's not absolutely true to say nothing is happening. It's probably truer to say that most of the things that are happening are below the radar and most people can't see them. So let me give you just a very quick example of how this works in practice and the power of it. A very dear friend of mine, Al Barrett, in Hodge Hill in Birmingham, when he started working in Hodge Hill, which had been labelled as, you know, an exemplar of broken Britain and had all of the negative labels that you could expect to come with that. And what he started with was, rather than trying to get early wins and come up with projects that would bring people behind them, which so many community builders try to do, he started to find connectors in the local community, what he called unsung heroes. And he found that was his starting point. They were doing things already, often very small things, often, you know, very much behind the scene. But by bringing all of those people who were doing things together into the same room as each other and saying thank you, and actually having conversations with them about what else they'd love to do if 4 of their neighbors helped them, and beginning to just build those connections, what he was able to do was actually build a huge amount of energy and momentum. So literally starting with, no matter how modest it is, starting with what's there and using what has been achieved as an impetus for us to build on some more of the possibilities, you know. So I think it's really important to appreciate what's there at the beginning, no matter how modest it is, or how small people might perceive it to be. There's never nothing there. There's always something. And I think we have to start with that. Otherwise, I think people will become very suspicious. I think people will become also maybe unsure that their very modest contribution will be enough. Whereas I think if we start by revealing the invisible or the modest things and building from there, what we'll find is we're truly grassroots.
Helen asks on comments, and it relates to something you said as well, that very often citizens are a bit nervous about taking ownership of their assets and their skills and exchanging them and doing things, because they feel that they have to ask permission before they create projects and new opportunities. How do you free people up, Cormac, so they feel they can do it themselves?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really, really important point. You know, I often say that you can create a client, but you can never create a citizen. So citizens are really ultimately confronted with their own freedoms. And part of that is beginning to help people go on the journey to identify what their public self is. You know, we're very clear about our private self and our family self, and maybe our professional selves, but we've actually lost sight of what it means to be a citizen in a lot of instances. And I think the first question to ask somebody, you know, it's almost that classic question, or do you just live around here, or are you a citizen? But a softer way of asking that is, what do you care about around here? What really keeps you awake at night? Do you have a dream for this place? And often what you'll hear is you won't hear the assets, you won't hear people's gifts initially. You'll hear people talk about their concerns, about their dreams, about maybe something that they are unsure anybody else will want. And maybe a lot of what they're looking for is a little bit of permission, a little bit of encouragement to share that, or maybe to meet 2 or 3 of their neighbors initially, who are prepared to go on a journey with them. So it could be something as simple as a mum saying, you know, I don't think there's a whole lot for young girls of 13 years of age to do around here. And my daughter is going to be on Easter holidays soon. And I'm worried she's going to get in with the wrong crowd. Do you find anybody else is saying that? And if I'm in a position as a community builder to say, well, yes, actually, I do. There's 7 other mums in the 2 streets either side of you who said the exact same thing. And they're meeting next Thursday evening. Would you like to come along for a coffee? They're meeting in Mrs. Miggin's house. Do you know her? No, I don't. Well, do you know the lady 2 doors up? She's coming. Oh, yeah, Mary. I know Mary. Well, if I knock in with Mary, would you come? Yes, I would, is typically the answer. So there's something I think somebody mentioned about trust. I think you can only ever go at the speed of trust when you're building community. So it doesn't work at the same speed as the contractual world or the professional world. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. So it's not about having people measure up or, you know, making sure people contribute to a certain level, but it's about taking people at where they're at. One of the things that I believe firmly about assets is starting with the question, what are your assets or your gifts, is not a good idea. I think it's much more powerful to start by listening to what people are concerned about or what they care about. And then once you're clear on what people care about, you can begin to explore what assets or what resources that they can tap into, you know, to begin to address what they care about. Francis, just one other thing on this. I think one of the things that I've noticed a lot around campaigns for social change is that sometimes we focus on assets that are external to the communities and trying to change them. So, you know, if only we could get better legislation, or if only that, you know, we could get local governments behave in a different way, or whatever it might be. And I think to an extent the tragedy in starting there, even though we might like to end up there eventually, but the tragedy in starting there is we're starting from the place where we're least powerful. And I think one of the most important things to start with is using what you have to begin with. So what I would call primary assets. So it might be that we're really worried about a local issue and a handful of parents are worried and want to do something. The impulse might be to focus on the external asset like the school or the hospital that we think is causing the problem. But I would always encourage people to start with what they have first. Start with your primary asset, something that's local to you and something that you can influence, and then grow your power. Because if you start there, you'll include more people. And that, just to conclude on that point, that's the big problem. When we start with big challenges and external problems that we're trying to change, we'll get a couple of the most powerful people involved, the most vocal people, the most able people, but the rest will just not come to the party. And that's one of the reasons why we see so few people engage, because communities are like football matches where you have 22 people who least need the exercise doing all the hard work and 3,000 people who most need the exercise telling them what to do.
Okay, some good points are coming up as you're talking, Cormac, including Danielle, who says she likes her haircut, but she hasn't come on video to show us. Lakshmi is here. Hi, Lakshmi. It's great to see you on here. She's talking about the trouble, the way local government is organised in this country with the cabinet system makes the empowerment side of local authorities more difficult than it used to be. Councillors tend to be more remote, I think she's saying. Then we've got several other people. Caroline, for example, has argued that it's important in communities about creating shared vision, because community involvement very often near election times is about councillors trying to involve you to help them get elected, but that's not what engagement is really. And she's talking about doing that, and a lot has come up about the way to find out what people need, what they want, what their visions are, is through storytelling. And if you can find a way of storytelling, that's a way of getting people confident about expressing what they want and then finding out a way of achieving it.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the main messages that outsiders send community is you're not good enough. You're not good enough to solve your problems. You're not good enough to solve your children's problems. You're not good enough to educate your children. And if you start thinking about this in practical terms, the more that community is seen to be low income, the less good enough it is. So any stories that remind people of their power and their capacity have to be a strong way of starting the journey. But I think that's the big thing in building community, is actually recognizing that we are good enough, and that we have a huge amount to contribute to each other. Because otherwise, if we're always focusing on, if the working assumption is the only way our communities are going to get better is if somebody from outside, whether they're elected or paid, is going to come in to make them better, then we're all the time looking over the hill for the solution rather than looking to each other for the solution. And ironically, when we do need the power to hold these people to account, we don't have it because we've been so busy looking over the hill, we missed what was around us and within us.
What about the point about storytelling? Because that's quite a powerful way of people expressing their needs and their desires.
Yeah, I think storytelling, I mean, there are two ways of knowing things in this world. One is through studies and the other is through stories. Studies are what institutions use to grow data and grow evidence. And stories are what we use to grow social movements. So if you think about how the civil rights movement has grown, you think about how people responded to the earthquake in Christchurch in New Zealand, you think about all of the different ways that people have pulled together during the times of the floods, etc. It's all based on the ability to tell stories and share stories and let those stories proliferate, because that's what inspires people. They see somebody who's just like them doing something that has changed things, and they think, well, if they can do it, so can I. And I think one of the things about storytelling that's really important is that it's a gift. It's a shared gift that in a way happens best when community comes together. So creating the opportunity for people to be in company with each other. I mean, typically, if you get enough people in a room informally with a little bit of fun, a party, for example, you don't have to teach people how to tell stories. It's a natural way of being in each other's company. So, one of the things that local authorities can do is not get in the way of that with silly bureaucratic rules around organizing parties and organizing street parties and get-togethers and things like that. These are all things that are really powerful. And storytelling, to my mind, is one of the most fundamental ways of being human and getting better at being human together.
Yeah, Helen says that storytelling is a good way of building trust. And a couple of other points have come up as well. Evan and other people have said that it's very critical to get politicians, especially local and national politicians, to accept the micro community. But Mark asks a question, which is a really practical one and a very good one. He says, do you have any suggestions, Cormac, to pathways to becoming community buildings ourselves? How would you suggest they do it?
Could you say that again, Francis? Sorry, I missed it.
He says, do you have any suggestions to pathways to becoming community builders for the people here on this webinar today?
Okay. Yes, I do. I think one of the first things probably is to pay really close attention to the fact that in every community, and probably in every street, there are people who are building community. So I suppose, in a sense, the first thing to do is to recognize that community building is a very natural and indigenous thing that people have been doing for millennia. But what we're seeing in different places and in different countries is the emergence of people who are doing community building for a living, and I think are providing a really important contribution. And in the UK context, as some people who are with us this evening will know, I've been putting a lot of time and effort into supporting the growth of a community building movement. And there's several hundred people across the UK now who would self-consciously say they're community builders, and many of them are in full-time employment doing that. And I think that will grow. I'm going over to Australia in May to speak with some 400 local governments about also creating the resource to enable community building to flourish in Australia. It's already happening there, but to enable more people to, I suppose, make it a way of life and to be able to sustain themselves and their family. So I think part of how we could actually attract people's attention to the power and the value of community building is by beginning to assert the power and the value of community itself. One of the things that's clear to me, and it's not true in every place I go to, but in many places I go to, that it's really hard to build community without some support sometimes. Time banking, we heard earlier on, is a fantastic platform that enables people to connect. But I have seen such huge value in having a full-time community builder who is dedicated not to an outside agency's agenda, whether it's health or, you know, a political agenda or a faith community agenda, but is dedicated to the community and isn't the person taking the lead. So they're not there to organize events or tell the community what to do. They're there to help the community connect and do what they want to do. So I think communities have to start advocating, if that's the kind of help they want, to start advocating for that kind of help. I recently was in a community where there were 37, this is a community of 5,000 people. There were 37 different professional people who had community engagement in their job title. And honestly, they were almost love bombing the community, but really what they were doing was doing community engagement. They weren't actually doing community building. And my question is, how can you engage with a community before you've supported that community to build itself into a community? So I think it's the missing element. I think that it's the main reason we have weak politicians and weak politics at times. And I think it's one of the main reasons why so many people aren't getting the support that they need in life, is because we haven't done the community building in the first place. So it's a hugely important thing, and part of the pathway around it is beginning to call third sector organizations and local governments to account around how they're currently just spending money recruiting clients for their services, and they're not actually spending money helping people get connected in their own communities and feel powerful, whatever their particular needs are, but also recognizing people have a huge need to be in community for as long as possible.
Okay, by the way, we've just got Sean who's joined us, who says he's a community builder, in Scotland, so welcome. We've got some people here who are saying street parties are a good way to actually find out about your neighbours and their skills and so on, and and that people are asking for hints about that within the chat. By the way, some people are asking whether this is being recorded, and the answer is yes. And on this webinar jam system, it's programmed to send you out a link to that within an hour of the webinar ending and the broadcasting stops, so you get a link sent out for the recording. What several other people have said is, including Caroline Collins, is the great issue in building a community and also having a good relationship with your local politicians, which is a point that someone else made, is trust. Trust is if you like, the cement, or not the cement, but the oil that makes things work. What do you do, or what's your advice, Cormac, when you go into an area and you can see that trust is broken down? How do you rebuild trust?
I think one of the things that's probably most important when it comes to rebuilding trust is to realize that trust has many different elements to it. You know, I can be very distrustful of a particular politician, but not distrustful of politics. I can be very distrustful of politics, but think that one particular politician is the nicest guy in the world. Trust is a very interpersonal thing, and it's very context specific. So I think my own view of it is, just thinking about some folks who were making the point around the importance of street parties and things like that, is start where people are. Start where people are willing to take action around things they care about and that they feel they can. So where there is sufficient trust. Trust grows on trust. And it also grows out of power. you know, because sometimes I'm in a much better position to trust somebody who, or to take some risks with somebody if I am organized at street level. So I'll give you an example of this. In certain neighborhoods in Edmonton, in Canada, what the community have started to do is they have started to identify community block connectors. And these block connectors are just people who are very gifted. They probably have what I have, the gift of the gab. They're good at connecting, they're good at building relationships with their neighbors, and they're trusted people. So they're not just loudmouths. They're actually trusted people, and they have a way with people. And in those neighborhoods in Edmonton, those individuals have been taking time and care to speak to each of their neighbors around the things that matter to them, and also the things that their neighbors are prepared to contribute. And what they've created, block by block, is they've created a gift exchange. And you can see this. So what they do is they use Google Documents, very simple technique, anybody could do it. Basically getting permission from people. So it's like a living time bank where people at neighborhood level will say, well, I'm prepared to contribute this. So if, for example, somebody is isolated or feels a bit, unsure of themselves when they go out past a certain time, they want somebody to come with them, I'm prepared to contribute my mobile. They can call me. And so really hyper-local, really practical contributions at neighbor to neighbor level. And what we found is when neighbors get to know each other by name and they get to know each other by gift, well, here's an interesting thing that starts to happen. When the trust between them starts to build and the power between them starts to build, then it becomes much easier, not alone to trust outside people, but also to hold outside people to account. So if they break trust, to have the sense that there will be a consequence. In Chicago, one of a 16-year study on what keeps people safe in their own homes in high crime areas. And you know, the two things that have been identified from that 16-year study as key determinants to public safety. The first is how many neighbors, not how many police, but how many neighbors you know by first name. And the second is the extent to which you can associate with them outside your own home in the likes of street parties or whatever it might be. They are more predictors of community safety. And also, interestingly, the third thing that study showed is the more the community is connected, the more powerful and capable they are of holding their police, their politicians, and public servants to account. So democracy works. And so I would start with creating street level neighbor to neighbor trust, build the power, and that actually creates a carrying capacity. That means that we can hold outside agencies much more to account and also bring the best out of outside agencies. I mean, some people believe, and I'm one of them, that politicians are the product of public consciousness. So in a sense, you know, we don't need more or less politics. We need more politics, but we actually need to become political rather than assume that we can elect people who do our political business for us. I mean, all of what we're talking about is political. Building trust is political. Designating or delegating that to one politician, to me, seems to be the dumbest thing in the world. So not surprising they break our trust when they do.
Okay. We're coming to the sort of end of the session now. We've had some really nice comments. Hannah's talking about the street party she did. I'm not sure where you're from, Hannah, but looks like you created a really fantastic event. And there's been a lot of really good comments. So thanks everyone for joining in and for those comments and for taking part. And if anyone wants to get more of your advice or make contact with you, Cormac, how do they do that?
Well, I'm delighted to say, literally, just as of a couple of hours ago, we've just launched a new website. So it's just a nicer looking shopfront window or kind of community window for people to go. So there's a lot of resources on that new website, and I'm just putting in the details of it now. So it's nurturedevelopment.org, and they're all free. So we just want to kind of just put it out there as a gift to people. But also, if you want to email me, I'll just put in my email address now, and I'm just really keen that we start. And so anybody who wants to co-conspire and start building some random acts of community building and mischief, I mean, I really think it's time to put down our iPads and put on our eye patches and start, committing acts of piracy in our streets. Let's have some fun. A friend of mine, Jim Deere, says, why have a meeting when you can have a party?
Okay, and I often say it's not how the party begins, it's how it ends that matters, and it's ended very well today. So thanks, Cormac, for doing this.
Pleasure.
And again, thank you, everyone. And if you want to follow up on this, you'll get a recording, you'll see the comments. But if you want to follow up further on this, let me know. Let me know what sort of information you need, what other events we might do to extend this particular topic, and we'll see what we can do to develop that. And just my plug as well, I've given you the link earlier on in the comments to GlobalNet 21 and our meetup site. If you join up there, you will see all our coming webinars, and you'll also be able to get involved in suggesting events and even, being involved in those events as well. So I'd love you to do that. So thanks again, everyone.